Hi guys, today we're going to be doing the PowerPoint over photography. So photography basically means painting or writing with light. And for photography, one of the things we're going to do, which is slightly different, is that we're going to go through the history of photography in order to talk about photography. Going through this history is going to allow us to look at how not only it did evolve, but also how the process works at the same time. Unfortunately, when we go through our history, we won't be able to stop and talk about photography by itself. So this gives us a really good opportunity to do that. All right, so let's look at some of the general uses that photography is used for. So the very first one is going to be journalism. Then we're going to have scientific research and advertisement. Now, also, we're going to have personal record keeping, which we're all very used to nowadays, right? We actually kind of abuse that part. And then the other one's going to be art. Now, as I mentioned before, we're going to talk about photography through its evolution, right? So the evolution of photography, we're going to start with camera obscura. So what is a camera obscura? So a camera obscura is an invention from the Renaissance. And during the 16th and 17th century, during the Renaissance, um, one of the things that's happening is this understanding or looking back in history into the era of the Greeks and the Romans, and there's an appreciation for this kind of approach to nature, right, to beauty. So the representation, the close representation of nature, as close to that as possible, was very very important. So how can we duplicate basically nature? So the camera obscura was the first iteration of that replica, right? So once again, so the desire to achieve accurate, idealistic representations of nature. So here's what the camera obscura looks like. So camera obscura is basically this really large black box, completely pitch black, big enough to hold a person. And then on this side, you're going to have a piece of paper or a canvas or something to draw on. And on the opposite side, you're going to have a little small hole. Now, what's going to happen is light's going to go through that opening, and then in here you're going to have the reflection of what's being outside in the inside. Now the difference is that the images are going to be backwards. Okay, there's no lens, there's nothing like that. It's just one specific hole on one side of the box, and then on the other side just going to have the image reflected on whatever surface. Now the artist is going to take a pencil or whatever and then recreate by hand what it's seen, but nevertheless it's a copy of sorts of reality. Now you're probably thinking, well, how does that work and how can that happen? Well, believe it or not, we all carry with us two camera obscuras, and that is it's our eyes actually. So our eyes are two camera obscuras. The difference is that our eyes are not square; they're just circle. And in one end you have an opening, right? And in the back of the eye, you're gonna have all the receptors. So as light goes in, it actually gets inverted, just like with a camera obscura, right? And then the cells in the back of your eye sends information to your brain, which puts it right side up. Okay, so it's actually something that's pretty natural that happens in nature. Okay, so that's the camera obscura. Obviously, with all technologies as they get better, they become smaller. Okay, so by the 17th and 19th century, we have the portable camera obscura. Now, by portable, we have a very interesting way of thinking of portability in our era, because for us portability is basically right a phone, um, something that fits in our pockets. With portability, most of history prior to our contemporary times, it was something that one person could carry. Now most of the time it was pretty heavy, but nevertheless one person could carry it. So this is a portable camera obscura. Now, what you're going to see here is that we're no longer, or the artist is no longer inside the box, but rather what we have here is going to be a lens, and we're also going to have a mirror. So the lens focuses the light in one specific spot, and then the mirror reflects it towards this area where obviously the artist is tracing the image from the outside. hopefully at this point you can see where this is going, right? With photography. Now, the next thing we're going to talk about is not specifically photography per se, but is the chemical approach to what we know now as photography, right? So, what did that come from? That came from Nipsey. So, Nipsey is a printmaker, and they created what we call a heliograph. So, Nipsh is a printmaker, and what he's trying to accomplish is trying to accomplish new ways of printmaking. And we already talked about lithography, and we talked about intaglio printing and things like that. Well, this is part of that research, that part of that experimentation that artists are doing in order to create better technologies to print with. One of the things that they are, or that Nipsh is experimenting with, is bitumen of Jodia. So this is kind of a resin substance that gets hard when you expose it to light. Now, what it is you apply it to the metal plate and then you expose it to the light. So you can see how we're starting to historically play with, a process where light is involved. Now, once you expose the plate, then you have areas where the bitumen is not going to be hard. So you wash this away with lavender oil, which is very soft. Okay. And then what we do is the same thing that we did with intaglio print, which is we dip the metal into acid, which etches it, and then you print it. So we already are familiar with that part of the printing process. However, as a photographic process, then there's a different step right here. And the step that was adding is not only do we have the bitumen on the plates, but now they're going to be sensitized with iodine gas, which is extremely corrosive. And this allowed them to take images with the camera obscura. So imagine putting the plates on the place where the artist would normally draw, right? So you will put the plate in on that surface, and then what happens, you'll have a chemical reaction where you can see the values basically between darks and lights, and therefore we have kind of a photographic process in which we call a heliograph. Helio meaning sun. And this is what the first kind of heliograph looked like, the first ever photograph. Okay, so this is the very, very first ever photograph. Okay, by Niepce, 1826. And what you can see here, I mean, it's discernible as, a building with roofs, rooftops, and a few other buildings in the background, right? Not very detailed, but nevertheless, a huge accomplishment of replicating nature, right? As the technology and experimentation expanded, then we have a new character come into history, and it's a person who helped and worked with Niepce, and his name was Daguerre. So Daguerre was also working in the printmaking process. However, Daguerre was a little bit more interested in the technology of photography, right, on the actual process more than the printmaking like Niepce was. So within this experimentation, one of the things that they used was silver nitrates right here, and just basically are salt with silver. And then what happens is that when you take that and you put it onto light, then the silver nitrates turn dark. Okay, so they change color. Unfortunately, Niepce dies in 1833, and Daguerre continues on with the process. Now, it's interesting and it's sad at the same time, from my perspective, that Daguerre didn't really give much credit with the name to Niepce. Instead, he took the full name, the full credit by putting his last name as the name of the process. So it's daguerreotypes. So a daguerreotype is a copper plate that's coated with a thin silver layer. Then it's exposed to mercury vapor, which is even much more toxic and corrosive than the iodine one. And it's been then fixed with a salt solution, right? Which is, here's your salt nitrate. Now, the problem once you expose the daguerreotype, there's a few things that are a problem. One is that you have tin plates that are not very big, so they tend to be small. They're very fragile. Okay, that little coating that it has with silver can be peeled off pretty easily. So normally you have to put a piece of glass in front of it, and it doesn't last too long. The other thing that's the negative of sorts, especially for them, it was kind of annoying in some ways, is that it lacked color. Color was also something that was out of the reach at this point. And last but not least, is difficult to use. Just the process itself is very consuming because of all the parts that have to be done. And then at the end, in order to expose it, you have to know how to expose it properly, etc. So here is what the daguerreotype looks like. Right? So here's the daguerreotype. And this was a fairly well-known daguerreotype because of one specific thing. When you look at this image, and it's called the Boulevard du Temple, which is a very, very busy street or boulevard in Paris, there's something that's very particular. And that is, if it's a busy street, why can't you see the carts and the people and everything that's going on? Right? Pretty empty. It's actually a pretty simple answer. And if you've taken a photograph of somebody moving, you've had this experience to where sometimes the person either is blurry or sometimes they're not even there. Same thing happening here. So this daguerreotype, the exposure is a very long exposure. So the individuals and things that were moving were not captured. However, the reason why this photograph is such a well-known photograph is because this is the first image that captures the human form in the photographic process. Now, we call it the first man or the first person to be photographed. However, I do think that in here we have two. So this is what I'm talking about, right? So you can see the outline of a person getting their shoe shined, right? So we can really identify that one person. However, to me, if there's a person shining the shoes and another one getting the shoe shines, there's two, not just one. However, for the sake of clarity, right, we can only see one figure completely clear. So that might be the reason why we call it one single person being photographed and not two. All right, let's continue on. This is what daguerreotypes look nowadays, or not nowadays, but what they look like and what you might have seen in museums, or maybe your family have some around. Stereotypically, we think of this kind of images when we talk about the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln, and the kind of that time era, which is accurate. So this is what a daguerreotype looks like. Now, one of the downsides of daguerreotypes is that you had plates of metal, and plates of metal when you're photographing. Imagine that nowadays with as many pictures that we take. Carrying plates of metal with you, I mean, it was very, very heavy. So one of the things that are happening at this point is trying to transfer the same processes from metal from metal into paper. So William Henry Fox Talbot is the person who starts or is experimenting with this idea of transferring information onto paper rather than to metal. So the photogenic drawing is basically when you take a paper and you cover it with solution of salt, similar to what you're doing with a plate, and then you soak it in silver nitrates or chloride. Basically the same process. However, the final outcome was not the same. Unfortunately, when you expose this kind of paper and you expose it to light, everything on the surface turns at once. So it doesn't change with the same value system as it does with the plates. So the only thing that could be basically accurately transcribed from nature to paper were botanical specimens. But that means leaves and flowers and those kind of things, because you can actually place them onto the paper and allow light to create the copy, basically. And then that's how you would have your photogenic drawing. You couldn't do the same thing with a person or with a landscape or anything else, right? Because those kind of specimens. So basically, what you would have is a silhouette image fixed fixed on the paper, and then they add sea salt and potassium iodide in order to kind of fix it to make sure that it doesn't continue changing, right? That the mechanical processes of of the silver nitrates do not continue to turn. Even with that, unfortunately, they were not permanently fixed. Eventually, all photogeneric drawings turned completely black. It was slowed down, but never completely stopped. So this is what a photogenic drawing looks like. This is just the processes. This is not one of the originals. Once again, because the original ones, all of this would have turned already black. And this is the photogenic drawing. Now, he did continue to work with paper and the same processes. And the next invention is what we call the caliotype, or beautiful image. The most important things about caliotypes is that Talbot used the technology and he was successful at reversing this idea of the negative to the positive. And if you've ever taken photographs using a regular film, you'll notice that the image is actually taken onto the film, and the film itself is a negative, not a positive. It's into the photographic process afterwards that we turn it from a negative into a positive. So he's the one that, in some ways, gave us that next step, right? Interestingly enough, was not the artist per se who end up creating the final product that we call nowadays photography. Instead, it was an astronomer, Herschel, who came up with the final solution to all the problems that most of those inventors and artists were having a problem with. And what he did is he experimented with a new set of chemicals, especially hyposulfate of soda. So hyposulfate of soda right here stops the reaction of all the chlorides and the nitrates and all of that. So stops all the chemical reactions. That way, the problem that Talbot had, with the helio, just transfers. I mean, he wouldn't happen anymore because now with the hyposulfate of soda, it just stops the action altogether. Now we call this hypo or a stop photography. And when you have a photographic studio, this is kind of what you're going to have in the studio. The first thing, on one side, you're going to have the dry side, and the other one, you're going to have the wet side. On the dry side, you're going to have the enlarger, and then basically what the enlarger is, you have a piece here that is photosensitive, and then there's a machine that you put your negative film on, and then you heat it with light that exposes the paper here, right, to the image on the negative. Which is basically what Talbot did, which is transferring the negative to the positive, right? And then in order to make the chemicals go through the chemical reaction, in order to start all that process, then you put in the developer. That is like heating the nitrates and all of the other chemicals on the paper in order to start developing from not being seen into the value system that you can see on a photograph. Once it gets to the point where you no longer want the nitrates and all the other chemicals changed, then you put it on the hypo or the stop valve, right? That would stop any chemical reaction from happening. And then you put it in a fixer. That it just helps with keeping maintaining the image and keeping it from, sometimes fading and a few other things. And last but not least, you're going to just put it in water to get any residual chemicals and whatever else you need out of that, and then you put it in the drying area. Now, when you're thinking about a photographer and a person who uses the darkroom, one of the most interesting things about the darkroom is having control over your image, kind of like what you do with Photoshop, but this one by hand. So you can have some effects done in the enlarger when you're originally exposed to the paper, right? Or one of the other things is right here, when you start developing, there is a level of skill that is acquired over years of experience to understand at what point stop the development of the image, right? So it's not underexposed or overexposed, right? In order to throw it into the stop back. That's part of the artistry and the skills required in order to do photography in a dark room. Here's a beautiful image. Okay. Later on, when we're talking about art history, it's going to make way more sense why these two kids are dressed like they are in a Greek party with little togas, and also the use of the umbrella. Nevertheless, this is Cameron, and she's a photographer. And one of the things that's interesting here is that she is using photograph beyond just record keeping. And as I mentioned before, most of the use for photograph up to this point, and even later until the beginning of the 1900s, photography is seen much more as a record keeping process rather than artistic process. However, Cameron here does have some artistic aesthetics applied to this. Okay. So that basically gets us to the point of regular photography, and we'll talk a bit more about how photography continues to expand, and we will do that later on with art history. Now, the next thing we're going to talk about is going to be photography itself, but the process of using a camera. How do you use a camera? Normally, what I'm about to tell you takes a full semester to talk about, to learn how to use a camera. Hopefully, you've used a camera in the past. And if you haven't, this will be a very crash course, basically, on how to utilize a camera manually or semi-manually. So as I talk about this, please keep in mind that a photographer, when it's taking images, has to think of all the variables that we're going to talk about and precisely put them together to create the perfect image. Okay, so the first variable we're going to talk about is going to be aperture. Aperture is the size of the opening in a photographic lens that lets the light come into the camera. Okay, so the aperture, and I actually have a camera here. The aperture is going to be inside there. You can actually kind of see it. It's kind of the highlight in the center of it. Okay. Now, depending on how you have it set up, okay, you can open up the aperture or close it up. Now, the smaller the aperture, of course, you're going to have a lot less light go through. The bigger the opening, you're going to have a lot more light coming in. Now, the funny thing about this is it's counterintuitive. Why? Because you would think, okay, less light, the smaller the number, right? That would be incorrect. This kind of works kind of like with, gauges for piercings. The smaller the number, the larger the piercing. Same thing here, right? Sorry, yeah. So the smaller the number, the larger the piercing. Correct. So here we go. So like an f16 is a very small opening, while an f1 or f point whatever is very, very, very open. Another thing that's counterintuitive is that you would think that with a very little opening that you're probably looking at a very narrow area of focus, and that's incorrect. When you have an f16 or when you have a very small opening, then you can have a much, much, much wide field of focus versus when you have a wide open aperture, then your field of focus can be very, very small. Now, our eyes are basically a camera, okay? And one of the things to understand and know about our eyes, especially when we're talking about focal points and we're looking at emphasis and other things, is that our eyes are like lenses. So we do have an aperture, and that's going to be our pupil, right? So we basically have kind of like an f2 and f1 type of aperture in our eyes, meaning that anything and basically the only area of focus in our eyes is a very small area in the center, kind of like what you see right here. We call those f-stops. So each one of those is what we call an f-stop. So if you're talking to a photographer and you ask them what's the f-stop, they will give you one of these numbers. Actually, there's more numbers than that, but that's kind of what I will give you. The next ingredient, the next thing to think about is going to be shutter speed. How fast the aperture opens and closes in order to allow light to hit the photosensitive area of the camera. Okay, and that varies completely, and it depends on the amount of light that's around you, right? So if you have a small um, opening, right, like an f16 as we talked about, and you have a very dark room, well, your shutter speed has to be way longer in order to let the light in to capture the image. And then obviously vice versa. So if you have a very wide open f-stop or aperture like an f1, or below, right, and you have a very bright room, right, the shutter speed has to be extremely fast in order for there to capture an image that's not overexposed. So shutter speeds go from like, 1/1000th, and there's from there even faster than that, all the way up to 8 seconds, 10 seconds, or minutes at a time. Especially when you're photographing the night sky, you can do very long exposure. And this is what we're talking about. So with regular light, right, and with a average aperture, this is what we're looking at. So it would be either an f4 or an f5 um, in order to get a regular image. However, if we take exactly the same image, right, with the same natural light or kind of quality of light, and the aperture is an f1, then look what happens. It's going to be overexposed. And then the opposite, obviously, if we have a very small aperture like an f16 or f22, it's going to be very underexposed. That's overexposed and underexposed. The other thing to consider in this whole group of ingredients is going to be movement. Okay, so here we have the same amount of light, right? And in this case, what we're changing is the shutter speed. So you see 1/8, 1/50th, 1/100, and 1/250th. Well, if we take an image in each one of those, if we allow the aperture to stay that much open, you see that the image is not going to be capture frozen. It's not until we get to this speed until we're actually going to capture frozen. Now, the problem with this is going to be that if, let's say, for example, it was later during that day, right? There's only so much you can do with the speed of the camera. Because if, once again, if we add more time, then we're not going to capture this ball moving. Or sorry, this ball in the air, just like this one. So that's something to keep in mind. And an artist or a photographer, when they are photographing anything, all of those things on their back of their mind. Okay, what's the focus area do I want it to be? Do I want everything to be in focus? Do I want to be overexposed? Do you want it to be looking like it's moving, or if it's frozen, or all of those things at once in their minds, and they're clicking and pushing all of these buttons, right? All of these things, what they're doing. Um, and if I was to turn on the camera and I show you what I'm talking about, so all of those elements right there, and all of these elements, and the artist or the photographer is having to change those things accordingly in order to capture the image and to have that perfect image that we all want, right? Now, we're very spoiled because our phones and our cameras, including this one right here, which can be used fully automatic, does those adjustments for us mathematically by reading the amount of light that it's around us. So depending on the amount of lumens around the room, the camera reads it and then adjusts both the shutter speed and the aperture accordingly to create a perfect, perfect image. All right. The next thing is going to be exposure, which is the total amount of light permitted to reach the photosensitive surface during the process of taking a photograph. Okay, so in other words, exposure is the aperture plus the shutter speed. That's what exposure is. So if you ask a photographer what was your exposure for that image, then they'll tell you something that kind of combines both of these things, right? So they'll say, oh, it was an f-stop of 22, and um, quality of shutter speed, not too fast, not too slow, or a very quick one. because it was a dark day or whatever. So they'll allude to both of those things. Now, some of them will be very particular about not giving those details out. They don't want to give up the secrets. Some of them will tell you right away. Another thing that's pretty cool is if you take an image with a phone or with a camera and you're using Photoshop or other kind of photo programs, the, the file will have that information there as well in case you wanted to duplicate that image the same way. So, like I said earlier, we looked at photography as basically a record-keeping process. But now let's look at it as as an art form. So in the early 1900s, it wasn't only until 1901 that photography was finally given the first show in New York City, and where photography was seen as a form of art. And the photographer who was given this honor was Stieglitz. Now, when you look at an image like this one, it may look pretty simple. However, what was being described or being kind of being told in some ways to the art community to make a case for photography to be part of kind of the arts is that here we have all of the elements and principles of design that a person who draws, sculpts, paints, or whatever uses, but in this case, through photography, right? Through this new media um, of, of creating things, right? So here we have, we have line, we have contrast, we have texture, and a few things, plus the skill in order to create an image like this. For us, it's pretty simple. Once again, create something similar to this, just because our phones and our cameras can recreate or do this for us. However, this kind of imagery required a high level of skill and understanding the materials because you had a really large camera. They had to put things in there, open the, expose the plates or the film, close it, know exactly how long to do that, and then basically at the same time or pretty quickly develop the film and then expose the image, right? To create the final picture, the final photograph. So it required a lot of skill, but also understanding of the elements and principles of design. So art became not art, but photography kind of was given entrance into the formal kind of visual arts realm in 1900s. Later on in the 1900s, as we're going through the era of modernism, one of the iconic movements of modernism is surrealism. And surrealism really enjoyed photography because photography tends to capture things that are very surreal that we probably don't recognize in our day-to-day or pay attention to. However, with photography, we can definitely do that. Here, for example, we have this great image, right, by Cartier Bresson, and showing us the kind of uncanny of reality. One of the things that our brains are really good at is keeping us from being freaked out of the things that could possibly go wrong or are inaccurate with the world around us. So, for example, we know that when somebody jumps up, they're going to come right back down. Our brains allows us to have that information, that kind of understanding of that process, right? However, the reality is that at one point, the person is levitating, right? At one point, the person is levitating, which is basically surreal because we don't really levitate, right? And there's many, many other uncanny things that happen around us if we're just kind of stop time for a second and then look at the contrary of reality within our reality. Photography allowed surrealists to kind of capture these odd moments. Here's one of them, as I mentioned. This person is floating in space, right? And the other cool thing is that there is a kind of a void here made by the water. But one of the coolest things here is the lack of the most obvious thing or objects in this reflection. So we can see that there's a reflection of this man, which is floating, right? We have the reflection of a lot of the objects that are here. However, the biggest and largest objects, which are the buildings on the back, are nowhere to be seen. So a very surreal image on regards to kind of this replica, right, of the world and this mirroring, but yet the mirror doesn't quite replicate everything you see. And the camera captures that and creating this really beautiful surreal. Here's another similar approach to surrealism through photography. There's a copy of the Alvarez Bravo's photograph at the Meadows Museum of Art. So if you make it to the Meadows, periodically they'll have a print of his display. Another artwork we can talk about is going to be a rayograph. And a rayograph is not technically a photograph, okay, but it's part of the experimentation of the photographic process. And Man Ray, who was also a surrealist in the modern era, he plays with this concept of the photomechanical process. And what he's doing is taking basically photo paper or photosensitive paper, and then he exposes it, to light. And what he would do is, let's say, for example, he had a piece of paper, and then he would put objects on top of the paper, right, and then expose that paper directly to the light. In some ways, he's trying to literally do what photography is accomplishing, right? So if you were to put reality right on top of a paper that's supposed to kind of photographically imprint that image, then when you put the objects right on the paper, what happens? And basically what happens is a very uncanny, very kind of non-representational image of shadows and values. And that's really, really interesting that you're putting literally the objects, the subject, the objects, something that's very much representational right on top of the paper. And then when you expose the paper to light, then you have the complete opposite object, which is a non-representational image with just basically values. So pretty cool, pretty interesting. But once again, it is not a photograph. That's a rayograph. Now, photography has been used for many different purposes, and social change is one of them, and where we create change in the world, and it comes not only in the world, but sometimes in our families and things like that. And a lot of them come from memorable images. So memorable images come from possibly the way they're presented. We have a sense that there's a person on the other side of the screen, a sense of the presence of a photographer, somebody that was there, a witness, basically. There he goes. But not only a witness of a photographer being there, but because we're looking at the images, we kind of become voyagers or witnesses as well. And the other thing that's very important about memorable images is that they steer our emotions. They connect with us on an emotional level. So images that stay with us throughout history are very, very important, especially with war, poverty, hunger, neglect, etc. Here's one of those very iconic world images of the Napalm Girl, right, by Kong Ut, and very, very memorable image. Here's another one that we recognize, right? It's kind of imprinted in our mind's eye. 9/11. Here's another beautiful one as well from the Dust Bowl. Most of you probably also recognize it. And then images like this one. You may not recognize this image, but this kind of image, or this body of work, I should say, change a whole city and possibly just the whole nation. Okay, this is Riz, and Riz is a journalist photographer, and he lives in New York City. And one of the things he was very much interested in was kind of exposing how individuals, how migrants were living in this very horrible conditions. They were living, many of them, in this clutter locations where you had 7, 8 different people living in one space, and then rotating during the day. So you have even more people living in one, in very close quarters. So here in this image, you can see at least what, 6 people, 7 people, right? However, he couldn't expose the problems that were happening at this point, because at this point, because there were really dark areas and there were small rooms, if you were to bring a camera in here and he would try to expose the images, you weren't able to capture the images because there wasn't enough light. It wasn't until the flash photography became available that he was able to go into this very dark quarters and photograph how these individuals live. And with this process, he was able to put together a whole book that's called How the Other Half Lives. And because of that, New York City eventually changed the way that the guidelines zoning, the parameters on how many people can live in a dwelling. And nowadays we have basically the same thing, right? There's city ordinances that require only so many people to live in a room, right? So all that comes from the works that Jacob Riis did in New York City to showcase how migrants were living. And up to many years ago, probably 10 years ago, anything that the camera was able to capture, we believed it. And had this kind of concept that the camera never lies. Obviously nowadays that's not quite the same, but nevertheless. The photographic work of putting a whole bunch of images together is what we call a photo essay, okay? And they're all kind of put together in just one single subject matter. And they're all there to tell a story. So it kind of works in so many ways like a poetry book. I don't know if you ever read poetry and you've actually gotten a poetry book, but each one of the poems can stand on their own, right? However, when you put them all together, they have this kind of overall concept or idea. A photo essay works exactly the same way. Each one of the photos tell a story. However, when you put them all together, it has a much broader concept or idea. Here's one, a very well-known photographer who photographed different disasters. And here's one of those images from one of her photo essays. Louisville flood victims. Another artist also who changed the world in a little bit for us here in the United States is Ansel Adams. Next to his work is that we have the protection of national parks. Well, of course, him and many, many more. However, his images help with creating that protection. This one right here, which is from 2008, almost 20 years ago. Okay, this is polar bear outside Barrow, and this is a photo essay about contraction of the polar caps. And we finally get to color photography. So color photography was first kind of experimented on and created in 1907. That's when the first color transparency came about. It wasn't until about 1930s, 1932, that Kodak began to make color film. Now, this color film was extremely expensive and it wasn't very, very good. By 1936, then we finally had Kodachrome film, which had better quality, but nevertheless is still very, very expensive. 1932, 1936 to 1940s is when you start seeing a lot of the color films like Gone with the Wind or The Wizard of Oz, and those kind of images that are using Kodachrome to create images, create films. However, one of the things that to me I find fascinating is that artists did not like color. One, because the negatives were not very good. But more than anything, and this is really, really interesting, is that color was associated with family snapshots and tourist photographs. So there was something cliche about color photography that artists did not like. They felt that black and white photography would eliminate the kind of commonness of color and kind of bring the qualities of whatever you're photographing, right, to a higher level, right? So you don't need color to make things interesting. You just need to have good composition and so forth and so on. So color was not something that photographers were very keen on. It wasn't until this 1960s, 1965, 1974, that Eagleston had his work shown in New York City, and it was a color photography show. Obviously, there's no major subject matter, but photography is at the core of this show. And in this case, for example, this image is intriguing because of the color, right? So we have this beautiful bright red color soda here on top of the black um, car that has this beautiful white area where the reflection is happening. And this wouldn't be the same if it was in black and white, right? It is not the same um, level of interest of focus if you do not have color. Color is very important. So Eagleston body of work push the importance and the reason why color photography is as much part of the art world as the rest of photography. So pushing the limits of photography. Here we have one that I find really interesting. This image is photosensitive paper that was placed underneath the water and then allowed the moon basically to create this image. So the image you're seeing is from underneath the water. This next photographic process is really interesting as well. This is a photographer from Vietnam, and he collected images of people who were missing from Vietnam War. And then what he would do is he would place the images underneath the leaves and then put them on his rooftop. And then the chlorophyll on the leaves and the photograph basically created a replica of that same photograph, creating these beautiful images on the leaves, the natural leaves. Here's another interesting approach to photography. Nowadays, and even back then, we had the possibility of doing panoramic imagery. Here, what she's doing, which is differently, is that she's given a panoramic image with the use of many other images. So here you have Niagara Falls, and what she's done is she collected this cards, right? These postcards, and when you started looking from one side of the gallery and you walk to the other side of the gallery and you look up and down, it's as if you were looking from one side of the Niagara Falls to the other. So it kind of, in some ways, panoramics the Niagara Falls, but one image at a time like this. By contemporary times, we can no longer say that the camera never lies. And there's a show that was in New York City also in 2010 by Jeff Wall that basically showcased this ability for us to basically fake reality with images. So this is called Falling Boy, and there was never a falling boy. Okay? It's a lot of the things in here are manufactured, created. So the end of the camera never lies. Here's a couple of contemporary artists that I think you should know. The first one is Vera Luther, and I love to finish up with her. And the reason why I like to finish up with her is because the way this image is created. So this is an artwork that is about probably 5 foot tall by about 3 wide. And this specific image, it is part of the collection of the Modern here in Fort Worth. And this is exactly what it looks like. And when you look at it, you say, there's something wrong with it, right? And the part that is wrong is that it's a negative. And it is a negative. The way this was created is it's actually pretty interesting because it kind of brings us full circle. What Vera Luther does, she goes to a specific location, in that case from the example that's New York City, and then she will get a room and then basically cover absolutely everything so there's no light coming in. Then he places one large sheet of photosensitive material, paper or material in one side, right? And then on the opposite side where the window's at, she will create, open the little hole in there and then allowed that amount of light to basically create an image on the photosensitive material on the other side. So literally what she's doing is she's creating a camera obscura, right? Same stuff that we started this PowerPoint with, right? The same kind of process where light it's replicating reality from the outside in a black box. So really, really interesting stuff. That's Vera Luther. And you can see this image at the modern. And the thing is that, is this a photograph or is this a negative? And in this case, it's a negative. It's not really quite there to be a photograph yet. The photograph kind of has the right the kind of turning it into the negative to the positive. So somewhere in there for sure. And then last but not least, artist that I want to mention that you guys should know about is going to be Cindy Sherman. And Cindy Sherman, it is the queen of selfies. She was the one who basically brought selfies to the context of pop art and contemporary art. I'm not talking about right away. This was a long time ago. And what she does with her work is it's play or understand the fakeness of ourselves with the world around us. So we all create these characters of ourselves when we're in public, and those characters change. And not only do they change, but they mutate sometimes, or they're completely fake and things like that. So she is very self-aware of those. And what she does is she recreates herself. These are also her portraits, in where she creates this kind of fake facades and then photographs herself with those fake facades, and then obviously creates the bodies of work. Cindy Sherman, you should look her up. All right, guys. So this is the end of the photography PowerPoint. I hope you liked it, and I'll see you guys for the next one.